Some people said that Barbara Fritchie herself and the flag story never existed. Others said it did happen, but that another woman was the valiant heroine. It turns out there was a real Barbara Fritchie who at the time of the alleged incident was actually 95, not the 80 years and 10 that Whittier attributed to her. She was well known around town for having once met George Washington. From that point on, the story became quite muddled, and neither the brave Mrs. Fritchie nor Stonewall Jackson could help. She passed away just 3 months later, after her 96th birthday. More importantly, Stonewall Jackson died in May of the following year, ironically after being accidentally shot by one of his own men. His death was a severe setback for the Confederacy. As to the alleged events in Frederick, Confederate military records clearly showed that Stonewall Jackson wasn't even there that day, although another Confederate general, A.P. Hill, apparently was. There were several claimants for the Fritchie role and various versions of what the rebel soldiers did or did not do to the Union flag. One of the most likely candidates for the real heroine was a local woman named Mary Quantrell, who was then in her 30s. If that name sounds familiar to Civil War buffs, it's because she was the niece of William Quantrell, whose renegade band of Confederate supporters, known as Quantrell's Raiders, wreaked havoc in Missouri and Kansas during the war. Its members included the famous outlaw brothers, Jesse and Frank James. Faced with all this hubbub, and probably annoyed by it, Whittier hemmed and hawed. After first saying he relied on, quote, respectable and trustworthy sources, unquote, he eventually admitted that the poem might have been a blending of 2 or more incidents. His final words on the subject were that there was a Mrs. Fritchie in Frederick who loved the old flag is not disputed by anyone. As for the rest of the story, I do not feel responsible. None of this, of course, diminished the popularity of the poem or the desire of the inhabitants of Frederick to publicize and even profit from it. Since 1927, a replica of Fritchie's home has been a popular local tourist attraction. There's a Barbara Fritchie horse race, and the story was turned into a Broadway play and 2 silent-era movies. And last but not least, she was even the subject of a parody in a Rocky and Bullwinkle TV cartoon in the 1960s. How much more famous can you get than that? If you're wondering about the moral of all this, I'd say 2 things. First, truth can be stranger than fiction. And second, in history, truth and fiction can get mixed up. So when you read history, follow the popular maxim, trust but verify. As a historian himself, Winston Churchill would certainly have agreed. Now let's finish our story about Churchill and the Civil War. In the summer of 1951, 8 years after Churchill's trip to Frederick, Maryland, Harry Byrd Jr., by then a young journalist, visited the great man in London. Their conversation quickly turned into a lengthy discussion of the Civil War, and Byrd reported, in 50 minutes, Mr. Churchill told me more about the history of the area in which I had lived all my life than I had ever known. His monologue was spontaneous, said with relish, glee, and great enthusiasm. I kept on thinking, why do I know so little about these great events? And echoes of the Civil War appeared one last time in Winston Churchill's life. On January 30th, 1965, 6 days after his death at age 90, a great state funeral was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. 25 years before, an iconic photograph of that cathedral, rising undamaged above the smoke of German bombs, had come to symbolize the resilience and will of Winston Churchill and the British people. The funeral had been meticulously planned years before, with much input from Churchill himself under the code name Operation Hope Not. The organizers later reported that one of the problems was that the designated pallbearers, although younger than Churchill, kept on dying and had to be replaced. Winston Churchill loved music, especially popular songs, and one of his favorites was the great Union anthem, Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. He had heard it on New Year's Day, 1942, when worshiping with Franklin Roosevelt at historic Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, sitting in the very same pew that had been occupied by George Washington and later by Robert E. Lee. Churchill asked that the hymn be played at his funeral, saying it would be a tribute to his American mother, and so it was. His old friend and comrade, Dwight Eisenhower, was there to represent the United States, which Churchill was proud to call the land of his forebears. The funeral was covered around the globe, including by Life magazine on one of its most famous covers. If you watch the film of the service, which is available on DVD today, you will see many a teary eye, both British and American, when that music plays. That cold day in January 51 years ago was a fitting epitaph for Winston Spencer Churchill, and a good place for us to finish. Thank you for being here tonight. I hope you have lots of questions and comments about this talk or any other aspect of Churchill's life, which I'd be pleased to discuss. Yes, sir.
Did he ever refer to his Native American ancestry?
He did, and there was some uncertainty.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. The question was, did Churchill ever refer to his Native American ancestry? He did, and was very proud of it. He was a descendant of a militia officer during the Revolutionary War. He also claimed, later as it turned out without much substantiation, to be descended from American Iroquois Indians. But he was very proud of that. And one of our members actually has written a book recently, The American Ancestors of Winston Churchill, which is several hundred pages of genealogy. So it was something he was very proud of. He actually was a member of the Society of Cincinnati, which is a very prestigious organization of descendants of Civil War officers.
So you're saying that there's a question about the story?
With the Iroquois ancestors, it turns out that the evidence for, let's say the evidence for that is lacking. You can't prove that he wasn't, but it's hard to prove that he was. But he was very proud, and he said he was 1/16th American Indian, and thought that was a nice thing, especially as a way of romancing Americans to cause them to identify with him. By the way, I have lots of stuff up here about the Churchill Center. If you want to get on our free email list, there's a form there. If you're interested in becoming a member and getting our magazine, there's a little card. Yes, sir.
I listened to a program just the last few days about the sinking of the Lithuania.
The Lusitania.
And the question that they brought up was whether or not Churchill was aware of it in advance or not.
Yeah, the question is about the sinking of the Lusitania. Eric Larson, who wrote a wonderful book about that, was here at the Writers' Conference Friday last week, and he actually touched on this, as he does in his book. That's a controversial question, and the opinions range from, the ship was packed with munitions in violation of international law, and the British were hoping that it would be sunk as a way of bringing America into the war, and that Churchill knew all about it. That sort of goes in the same category as people who think that Churchill knew about Pearl Harbor in advance, but didn't tell Roosevelt because he wanted to bring America into the war. The evidence, from what I understand, is a little murky. I think the fairest thing to say is that there was an apprehension that German submarine warfare could affect British merchant ships. What was actually on the Lusitania is a subject of all kinds of theories. Was it cordite for explosives? Was it real munitions? So my feeling would be to say, just from my sense of Churchill, is that he didn't know specifically that the Lusitania would be attacked. When it was of course a tragedy. The irony is, if you ask people today what happened after the sinking of the Lusitania, the answer would be, well, and Eric Larson actually talks about this, a few months later America came into the war. That was, I think, the spring of 1915. America didn't enter the war until April 1917. So if it was a plot by Churchill to lure the United States into the war, it took 2 years for the plot to hatch. So that's my reading of it. But if you go online, there are thousands and thousands of pages about this, and all kinds of theories, ranging from conspiratorial to more sensible. So that's my read, and I suspect Eric Larson would somewhat say the same thing. Anything about the Civil War that you guys knew? Are there any Civil War buffs who can correct anything I said? Because you're welcome to. I know something about Churchill and the Civil War I learned along the way.
Only Pickett's charge was not on a little round top, it was on a cemetery.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I will correct that. Thank you. Okay, good. I'm doing this talk at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond in October, and it's going to be full of experts, so that is a good, maybe I should leave it in just so someone from the audience can stand up and say, you're wrong, Mr. Pollock. But thank you for that, and I will amend my remarks accordingly. Civil War buffs know so much stuff about every battle, every general, everything else, it's almost inexhaustible. Yes, ma'am.
Did Churchill gain anything from Lincoln's relationship with McClellan and his own relationship with Montgomery?
Say that again?
You know, Monty?
Yes, General Montgomery.
But that seems to have been a parallel conflict too.
Yes, there are a lot of parallels between the Civil War and the Second World War, particularly how Churchill dealt with his generals. One of Lincoln's problems, since you are a good Civil War buff, you can help me with this. One of Lincoln's problems that his early generals, McClellan and so forth, were not the kind of courageous fighters that he wanted. Churchill had the same issue. He sacked a number of generals in the early years of the war, partly because they lost battles and partly because he thought they were too cautious in their approach. Churchill liked Montgomery because he thought Montgomery was someone who would take the battle to the enemy. Now, some generals would say the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was too eager to throw forces into battle, for the sake of it. So there's a counter story to that. But certainly Montgomery's a difficult character for lots of reasons, but certainly he played a key role in the war, especially before the United States became involved. Yes,
To
sir.
throw a wet blanket over everything you said tonight, since you're going to do the speech again, the date of death of John Singer Sargent is 1925.
I will correct that.
That's on the label of that.
Yeah, okay.
That nice charcoal drawing you showed.
Sargent did paint the Churchill family and Jenny Churchill a number of times, but I will correct that. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
How accurate is the book that came out last year on Clementine?
On who?
On Clementine.
The question is about a book about Clementine Churchill, Churchill's wife, that came out last year. I know the author, Sonia Purnell, quite well, and there had never really been an independent, third-party book about her. And I think the book is pretty accurate. We helped her with some of her research. There are some nuances and interpretations. The reason she wrote it is she felt that Clementine Churchill's role in her husband's life, and especially in the Second World War, had been somewhat overshadowed by Eleanor Roosevelt, because Eleanor was so much more of a public figure, independent in her own right with a newspaper column and so on, and Clementine was more behind the scenes. So that book is a good step to restoring her reputation, which had been somewhat neglected by historians. And it's a book you should get for your library if it's not there. Yes, sir.
My understanding is that book could be viewed as destroying Clement's reputation in a number of ways.
Well, I think it is candid about some of her issues. She suffered from depression. Being married to Winston Churchill wasn't easy. And working for Winston Churchill wasn't easy. Being his child, 3 of his 4 children had very rocky lives. So he was a difficult person in a lot of ways to get along with. And some of that comes out in the book. There were always rumors that she had some kind of affair in the 1930s, and I don't think she did. But the book is a candid. She died in 1977, and it's a candid look. But I think it's accurate. I've not seen any issues of major errors of fact. When someone's been dead for 40, 50 years, things come out and get interpreted differently. The only previous major book about Clementine had been the one that Mary Soames, her daughter, wrote, which of course was taken from a different perspective. So I wouldn't say it destroyed her reputation. It humanized her, and I think it acknowledged, the important things that she did, aid to Russia being, for example, one of them. But she had her own issues in life, as everyone does, and said being married to Winston Churchill for 60 years was not easy. He was could be a difficult husband, father, prime minister, military leader, and so forth. That was probably the source of some of his greatness. If he'd been an easygoing, affable, go along, get along kind of person, he probably wouldn't have accomplished the great things that he did. Yes, sir.
Would you comment a little bit about the unpopularity of Winston Churchill when he was at the end of his term?
Yeah, in 1945?
Yes.
Yeah. The question is about the British election in 1945. Churchill had saved Britain, helped to win the war, was at the peak of his popularity. There was they had rudimentary public opinion polls in those days, and he had an 80% approval rating, which I don't think any American president has had recently or will have in future. And then there's an election in July of 1945, and shockingly, the Labour Party, which had been in a coalition with Churchill during the war and whose leader, Clement Attlee, was the deputy prime minister, sweeps to power, and there's this enormous, it was the first British election since 1935. And Americans in particular have a hard time understanding that. How could the people of Britain reject this great man who had just, saved their nation, saved the empire at least temporarily, and did so much for them? And the real answer is the election was about domestic politics. It wasn't about gratitude or ingratitude. It was said that there were some people who voted out of ignorance for the Labour Party candidate in their local constituency, but still thought that Churchill would still be the prime minister afterwards. Obviously, that wasn't the case. So this was about what kind of state did the people of Britain want after the Depression, after the struggles of war, the casualties, the privations, and they wanted a different kind of country than they thought the Conservative Party itself would bring. And the Labour government brought in a lot of innovations, the National Health Service, pensions, nationalization of industry, a whole lot of things that turned Britain into a modern, call it social democratic state. The irony is that Churchill was returned to power in 1951, and he did almost nothing to reverse those measures of socialism as much as he had campaigned against them in 1945. It wasn't until Margaret Thatcher became prime minister years later that a lot of those things were changed. So that's the short answer. Ironically, the group in which the Labour Party was most successful in terms of votes was returning servicemen, because they had suffered the most, and they were the ones who really thought that Britain should be a different kind of society than the Conservative Party might necessarily bring. So that's a short answer to it, and it's hard to understand until you look at the domestic. My other last comment for this is Churchill ran a bad campaign, and in one of his speeches, he talked about what the Labour Party would do if it came to power, and he said they would start off slowly, and then he said that sooner or later they would be forced to resort to Gestapo-like measures. And that was a phrase that didn't go over well with the electorate. It was obviously, his wife Clementine told him not to say that, and did anyway. So that soured a lot of people against him. It was an unfair accusation against the Labour Party. So that's sort of an answer as to what happened. But he came back to power in 1951 and served again a second term until 1955.
There's a recent British television series about crime in Birmingham in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
Peaky Blinders.
Yeah, I know I've not seen it.
That paints Churchill in a very, very negative light as a scheming, murderous person. Does that reflect the changing of his view?
Well, people always ask me, where is Churchill more admired, in the United States or in Britain? And I say in the United States for sure, because we only know about the good parts of the story. 1940, saving the world, the great statesman, the great orator, and so forth. But by the time 1940 came around, he had been in British politics, in and out of the cabinet in particular, for 40 years. So there's a whole series of domestic political issues about the general strike, the coal miners, the black and tans in Ireland, lots of things that people in Britain, especially of a liberal or socialist point of view, blame on Churchill, unfairly or not. I have not seen that series, but I'll tell you a story. My son's a student at the University of Virginia, and one of his friends is a kid from England whose family now lives in the United States. So when my son's first year, we go out to dinner with the family, and they're British. So I said, oh, good, I'm going to talk about Churchill. So I go on and on and on, and they're listening, but they're not signing on to this. So there's a fun. I finish my riff, and there's a little pause, and the mom says in a British accent, "Well, Lee, that's really very nice. But we're socialists in our family." So some people in Britain still have memories of Churchill, the conservative politician, and not Churchill, the war leader. So that comes from the BBC in particular. Always has an axe to grind about Churchill, which goes back to the time when the BBC kept him off the air in the 1930s because they thought he was had a wrong opinion about Hitler.
Maybe you should talk some more about that.
About the BBC?
Yeah.
The short story is the BBC, which in the 1920s and 30s was the only broadcaster, obviously no TV, just on radio, in Britain, was run somewhat dictatorially by, I think it was a Scotsman, John Reith, later Lord Reith. And he was not a fan of Winston Churchill. And during the 1930s, a lot of people in Britain, conventional opinions, said, oh God, here's Churchill going on again about India, and look, he was on the wrong side of the abdication crisis, and why does he keep on talking about Hitler? We'll make some accommodation with Germany, and they're just restoring their normal place in the world. So Churchill went on and on and on about this stuff, and the BBC was, John Reith supposedly in particular, did whatever they could to keep Churchill off the air, and that was his wilderness years. He had supporters. It wasn't just Winston Churchill alone by himself. But conventional opinion, especially in the British aristocracy, was there was no desire for another war, and Hitler was a German nationalist who did some bad things and said some bad things, but did some good things as well. So that was a popular perception, and people asked why why did few people listen to Churchill's warnings about Hitler? And part of the answer is Churchill was like a broken record. He wore out his welcome. His position on India was stubborn and ultimately ill-advised. So he sort of painted himself into a corner in some ways that made it harder. Now, obviously, the tide of events by 1938 and 1939 proved otherwise. And as soon as the war started, Neville Chamberlain brought him back into the cabinet. But Churchill was considered by respectable people to be unstable, reckless, aggressive, emotional, flamboyant, unreliable, brilliant, but not a trustworthy person. And so that was the perception in the 1930s. And John Reith had that perception, so whenever he had a chance to keep Churchill off the air, he certainly took it. So thank you for coming. I'll come back next year and talk about Churchill and something else. And thank you for 2 good corrections. I knew I'd get something good tonight.